Greetings, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us on today's webcast. My name is Dina Evans, and I'm the Senior Manager of Global Events here at LookingGlass Cyber Solutions. I'm very excited about today's presentation titled Surgical Threat Mitigation, Sharpen Your Response. Our group of presenters for today's webcast are Paul Roberts, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Security Ledger, and Brandon Dobrec, who's the product manager here at LookingGlass. And then we have a special guest today, who is Chris Roberts. He's one of the world's foremost experts on counter-threat intelligence and vulnerability research within the information security industry. Very excited to have you gentlemen with us. Before we begin on the webcast today, let me just cover a very few quick housekeeping notes. For our audience, please note that there is a chat window, so please feel free to submit any questions that you may have for our presenters through that window. We'll be addressing these questions at the end of today's presentation during the Q&A section. If we happen to run out of time for the questions that are submitted, don't worry about it. We will still contact you directly after the conclusion of the webcast to make sure you get your questions answered. Also note that any questions that do come in through the chat window are only viewed by our presenters. So if there's anything that you want answered directly and privately after the webcast, please note that. There's also an attachments and links section. Please feel free to peruse those. There's some resources that are relevant to today's topic. And then lastly, and very importantly, if any of you would like to obtain 1 hour of CPE credit toward your professional certification for viewing today's webcast and didn't happen to enter your membership number when you registered, feel free to send us your membership number through that chat screen. It'll tell us who that came from, and we'll make sure that you get your credit. It's pretty simple. And now, without any further delay, at this time, I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to our presenters, and we'll let Paul get us kicked off. So, Paul, please take us away.
Hey, Dina, thanks so much, and thank you to everybody for tuning in. As Dina said, this is Surgical Threat Mitigation, Sharpen Your Response. I'm Paul Roberts, and we've got Brandon Dobrec from LookingGlass and Chris Roberts, who I should start out by saying is actually not a relation of mine, although we're maybe brothers from another mother, but just two guys named Roberts on the same webinar. This is I think a really important and timely conversation that we're having today, and we're going to start off. I'm going to start off just by saying a couple words about myself and Security Ledger, and about kind of the overall threat landscape that and trends that I cover just as a reporter and at Security Ledger, and I've been covering the cybersecurity space for 15 years. So Security Ledger, first of all, independent cybersecurity news website, securityledger.com. We cover a lot of stuff in the information security space. Some areas of expertise around Internet of Things and security, critical infrastructure, and of course, advanced threat. We've got a podcast, which you can subscribe to at securityledger.com subscribe. And we've also got some newsletters. So check us out if you haven't already. And that drawing does look a little bit like me. Moving on, I think in order to kind of get the most out of today's conversation, it's good to just understand what some of the high-level security trends are that we're seeing, and these might be things that you in your own work are experiencing as well. Obviously, we can all say that attacks are becoming more sophisticated and targeted against particular organizations. So, many of us are around long enough to remember the sort of indiscriminate attacks, I love you and so big and NIMDA and those kind of polymorphous internet worms that, if you were vulnerable and running the right Microsoft product, they hit you, and if not, then they didn't. That's not the world we live in anymore. You, as a sophisticated organization of any size, really face a number of adversaries online. Top of the list, probably cyber criminal groups looking to steal and monetize your data and information, but also increasingly nation-state actors, the North Koreas and Russia and Chinas of the world. They could be after intellectual property. They could be after just causing disruption or sending a message. They could be using you to get to, some organization or downstream or upstream customer that you might have or business partner. And then, of course, disgruntled and current employees, disgruntled former employees, disgruntled business partners. Those are always on the threat landscape as well. Down there, not listed, also hacktivist groups, kind of ideologically motivated actors. They're less of a prominent issue than they were 6 or 7 years ago when we were all talking about anonymous, but they're still out there and they still matter. Okay. In terms of the the threats and types of attacks we've seen, obviously we're all familiar with the WannaCry and NotPetya wiper attacks. Ransomware, obviously a huge problem right now and a platform of choice for cyber criminals in terms of getting data out, that as well as kind of crypto mining software. So there are a range of different threats that you're facing as well. How does it look in terms of our ability to detect, respond to, prevent attacks? If we're to believe reliable sources like Verizon and the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, we're not doing a lot better. Same dynamic that's existed for much of the last decade still exists, which is it takes a long time for companies to note that they've been hacked. On the adversary side, it does not take them long to compromise companies. If they are interested in getting a beachhead at a particular firm, there are many different avenues to do it, and data that Verizon and others have gathered suggests that time to compromise could be measured in hours and certainly days, whereas time to detection much longer, days, weeks, months. That's a bad dynamic. It's a persistent one. It's a problem. In terms of who is attacking us, I think again Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, good source of data. About 3/4 of them outside the organization, a little more than a quarter inside, and then 2% involving business partners. I think if we broaden that, we're probably going to find actually that business partners and third parties are a growing share and probably greater than 2%. But that's what the Data Breach Investigations Report said. Profit and cyber espionage still the top motivation. And then, interestingly, malware, which we all talk about a lot as the big concern or problem, only around 1/3 of incidents were malware related. Hacking, and I think, as we'll see, fileless attacks are increasingly common. So it's not necessarily just ransomware or wipers you need to worry about. Even more dangerous, elusive are the attacks that simply, live off the land, use systems, applications, tools that are already present in your network environment to move laterally, gain a toehold, and increase their access to sensitive data and assets within your environment. That said, one of the reasons I started Security Ledger, and one of the persistent problems I see is that the cybersecurity industry, such as it is still very much focused on solving old problems like malware or like perimeter-based attacks on defined IT environments. This is data from a really interesting Accenture report from this year. That cybersecurity programs, about almost 2/3 of them are really those types of traditional IT programs with traditional IT defenses focused on kind of central office type environments. And that, more than 30%, close to 40% of those organizations don't apply the same standards as they do to their own IT infrastructure to their business partners and suppliers. So that, not surprisingly, has not escaped the notice of sophisticated cyber adversaries who are targeting those organizations as downstream companies as a way to access or get access to more valuable upstream targets. So only around a third of cybersecurity programs extend to third parties. And we've seen this recently. I mean, I think if you were to look at the headlines, just recently we heard about a group that Symantec calls THRIP. This is a Chinese-based APT group targeting defense, aeronautics, satellite firms. Kind of classic cyber espionage. But this is one that is using fileless attacks. So they're using existing tools, whether it's PowerShell or other network admin tools, to gain and increase access to those networks. We've seen the Trisis malware targeting critical infrastructure in Saudi Arabia linked to potentially Iran-based APTs. So it's a very complex environment, and it really kind of raises the stakes on companies to think outside the box in terms of threat detection and prevention and response. That's kind of what we're here talking about today. And I think what the folks from LookingGlass and Chris are going to help us to understand, maybe what some best practices are around that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand off to my very able co-presenter, Brandon Dobrec from LookingGlass, who's going to talk to you about what LookingGlass is seeing and some of their best practices and advice. Brandon.
Paul, thank you so much for that introduction and for the background on the security market as a whole. For everybody's benefit, I do occasionally have a tendency to talk very quickly, so feel free to flag me down from the audience if I start getting ahead of myself. From our side, initially I wanted to talk about sort of the maturity of security profiles that we're seeing now, and sort of in conjunction with what Paul was saying, the different types of attacks. So large companies definitely do have more mature security profiles. They have systems and policies in place which increase the difficulty of obtaining access and obtaining secure information. And they're able to put pressure back on adversaries to increase cost and increase time. And while people are ultimately fallible, ultimately it's easier to attack through less secured vectors. And what we're seeing with that is a trend to attacking larger companies through third parties or supply chains, vendor management, etc. As per RSA, the RSA report for 2016, it was something like 47% of attacks on an enterprise were occurring through, or rather on a company were occurring through third parties, and if you limited that to only enterprise level companies, the number went up to 63%. So that sort of 78% of outside attackers that Paul had mentioned before, the way that they are predominantly and overwhelmingly gaining access is through the networks of those people's vendors. They have to provide privileged access and network connectivity to the people who provide them services, whether it's through payment processing, HVAC systems, as we learned through the target breach, or something as simple as payment transfers. Since the very high-profile Bangladesh bank hack in 2016, there's been any number of SWIFT payment attacks taking place. It is a third party that banks are largely dependent on for doing money transfer internationally. And oftentimes third parties that are given privileged access, they don't have necessarily the wherewithal to protect their own networks to the same degree. You may see companies that have 1 or 2 person IT departments that are expected to also handle the security of the organization, and unfortunately they do fall into the sort of Google or bust category. If it's not easily Googleable or easily figured out through following simple steps, it's easy to lose track of. And knowing the entire topology one's own network is difficult. Knowing the topology of a vendor's network is nigh on impossible without either them having phenomenal documentation practices or having some sort of third-party tool that allows you to look into that. And networks are continuously getting more complex. We're getting more and more third and fourth party connections as the internet grows and as companies grow. Large scale companies can have upwards of 4,000 or 5,000 vendors that connect to their own internal network. Oftentimes through a DMZ, but not always. And direct connections aren't even the only risk in third parties, with the prevalence of secure email gateways and standards such as DMARC and DKIM and SPF, the difficulty of spearphishing has gone up a lot and the phishing has gone up a lot. But one of the easier ways to attack it is actually through compromising a legitimate mail server.
I think, Brandon, it's probably worth pointing out at this point as well that if you look at security, it's almost a game of jigsaw. In other words, if I'm looking to attack you as the large corporation, if I look at you, I'm obviously going to gather a certain amount of intelligence. If I look at all of your third parties and your suppliers and your vendors and your manufacturers and everybody else that you're using on a local, domestic, global basis, even if I can't find an exact direct way in through any kind of third-party connection, what I can do is gather more and more intelligence on you from basically what's being leaked from them, either directly, indirectly, reportedly, or anything else. So what I'm doing is I'm building up a much, much more comprehensive picture of exactly how to attack you, which then leads into the following sets of conversations about phishing, spear phishing, and everything else. So it's unfortunately you can't always control what's leaking out of your own network, let alone what's leaking out of everybody else's network about you, including the vendors. The fact that we can go onto major vendors' websites and see how much technology they've sold to all the multinational organizations, and now we know exactly what we're up against.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Reconnaissance is a lot more in today's day and age than simply scanning a network or a web server for an individual company. As cybercrime becomes more and more productized and more of a business, the tactics and techniques expand accordingly, and sort of there are best practices and business practices for cybercrime at this point, many of which involve building that full puzzle picture, as you said.
Well, I think it's also, it's a business unit. My role in the criminal side of the world is potentially to be able to gather intelligence and hand it off to you, and you can build some kind of an attack vector against it. My pure role is maybe just gathering that intel on a very specific set of attack vectors. So, it's a business as a service. No difference than going to Google and saying, give me competitive intelligence. That's pretty much all that's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's for any company, not just large companies, not just companies with extensive amounts of vendors. I mean, even a single connection gives that research gatherer in that business enterprise another foothold to gather information from.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing is, on top of that, as a vector for entry to networks, companies with single points of failure have even more to worry about, because it's not just an access point, but it's also something on which your business hinges, whether it's a connection to a particular data type or data source, or a company that's reliant on a single mining company that provides critical metals for product development, whether they're developing a chip that's reliant on a metal that can only be gotten from a country like Russia, and it's only mined by a single company, or a company in the U.S. that's reliant on a single pharmaceutical manufacturer that's the only one that's allowed to handle coca leaves before Novocaine is extracted. As Paul had mentioned, people are sort of moving away from the more destructive for destructive sake attacks, but it's a way to hold a company for ransom without actually knocking out their own networks if you take down a single point of failure.
Well, you also end up, you also end up with one of the areas we've been taking a fairly extensive interest in is the ability to manipulate markets. So there's definitely been some interesting intelligence, counterintelligence, and malicious stuff being spread across social media about certain companies that obviously is based off of a potential single point of failure or a potential issue, which then manipulates the stock price in, potentially the favor of whatever I'm betting. So again, it's gathering intelligence, using it for gain, not necessarily to attack or hack you, but potentially to benefit directly from a market activity.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that we're seeing state-sponsored actors do to make profit to drive their activities, criminal groups to do as well as actually terrorist groups. So.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's really interesting, and you come back to the Target incident, which was, it seems like forever ago, it was so long ago, but it was the first one, I think, first incident kind of broke through with people talking about, in that case, an HVAC contractor, and kind of broadening the scope of risk to not just, what your, what business connections you have, or what connections out to your, what data connections you have from your network to suppliers or business partners, but also just, the kind of the physical space of your building and your facilities, and kind of how that is part of your risk landscape as well. And I think, up prior to that, I think sophisticated financial services, defense industrial-based companies probably thought along those lines, but not retailers, and not folks further down in the risk spectrum. But the list is very broad of organizations that could plausibly be used to gain access to your network or to sensitive data.
Well, if you think about it now, it isn't just, that brings up the whole question, where is my data? We go back to when we started this stuff, which was my data was on the mainframe and it was in a room, and that was great. And then we started spreading it to, servers and desktops and systems. And to some degree, we still had the ability to say it was inside our four walls. So really, we were looking at people trying to get into us, or when we handed it over to us. But now with, the regular IT, with shadow IT, and with everything else that's out there, we're putting that data on, 101 different service providers' sites, and then wondering why on earth, it's not where we left it a week later.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the sort of the old mainframe model, because I do think that we're moving back towards, at least from a both perception standpoint, trying to centralize our data again. In many ways, cloud is just the mainframe model all over again. It's you have a central storage place and a whole bunch of green screens connecting to it. But it's putting the onus of protecting, configuring, managing that centralized mainframe on somebody else. And it's very simple to misconfigure. One of the breaches that I intended to talk about a little bit later was around the Booz Hamilton contractor issue, and how he had the SSH keys stored supposedly securely in the cloud, but the over-reliance on, it's moved back to a centralized repository, it's got somebody knowing what they're doing managing it, I don't have to worry about it. I can just stick keys on there in plain text.
Yeah. Well, that's no different. You look at I think I posted something up online a couple of weeks ago where a good friend of mine did a quick sweep, and then we took the code, resweeped on some additional criteria, and pulled in a whole bunch of open S3 buckets, which are still sitting out there misconfigured. And there's privacy there, there's intellectual property, there's passwords, there's all sorts of intel in there, and it's definitely one of those where people are sitting there thinking they've actually got their stuff secured, but unfortunately, obviously, it's not.
Yeah. Well, and I think if you look at some of the work like Chris Vickery and UpGuard have done, exposing some, exposed or calling attention to, exposed data on whatever, Amazon S3, Google's cloud, often, first of all, it's, astounding the data troves that he's stumbled upon just in terms of their diversity and also their size. And behind those is often just, seemingly pretty innocent configuration mistakes, allowing, universal authenticated user access to those storage buckets, but not understanding that means basically anybody with an S3 account can view your data, just kind of misinterpreting what that checkbox means.
Right.
And so the agility of cloud is amazing and transformative, but it also makes it really easy to make big mistakes at scale, right? To expose just a tremendous amount of
It's consolidated.
Yeah.
It's consolidated. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, this is no different. This is no different than we used to do when we used to go trawling for FTP sites. I mean, we would scan the net for open FTP sites. Or for readily accessible FTP sites, and just harvest the data off of those things. Now, for that we actually had to scan the entire bloody internet. In this day and age, all I've got to do is just go out to the entire, be it Google, Amazon, or 10, 15, 20 other cloud providers, and just go through their entire architecture. It's done to the mainframe argument. We've done a really nice job of consolidating all the data back into some readily available areas.
Well, the problem is even if it is well secured, there's the GitHub issue. A junior developer has keys or access to something, he leaves them on his GitHub. Now you're scanning GitHub to pull things that match Amazon, AWS keys, and then you have access to a locked door. And there's another point of failure, not coming through Amazon or configuration, but coming through a third party. And all credit to GitHub as well for doing what they can to sort of help prevent that with the rate limiting on the API and things to prevent people from just hitting everything and pulling it out. But
yeah, but it's still fairly easy, and it's the ability to quickly search through GitHub or any of the others. I mean, there's so many of the others. I mean, there's 100+ base bins out there. You've got GitHub, you've got JetBrains. I mean, hell, go through the Oracle forums or go through the Cisco forums for firewall configs. I think last I checked on one of the Intel platforms, we had about 750,000 Cisco configs, all with the keys.
Or Slack channels, IRC channels, in far ago misspent use, found some config files for Cisco ASAs on IRC.
Yep. Yeah. Quick and easy method of having communication, but unfortunately it's wide open to everybody else.
Yeah. So Paul, I love that you brought up Chris Vickery, because actually the next, or rather the very first breach that I had wanted to bring up was around the largest voter data breach in history, and he was actually the one who identified it. It was the Deep Roots Analytic voter data breach. That was it was an AWS server that the voter data was stored on in plain text, and it was misconfigured. It was that exact way where anybody could look at the bucket. It was 198 million users' data, which is like 61% of the total U.S. population. And this this breach, this knowledge, was a big part of sort of threat actors going in attempting to compromise the systems that gave the voter information when it went public. So, yeah, this is something that's sort of a simple fix. Just mapping the web information, mapping the servers, understanding the server configuration, doing scans on your bucket could have preemptively shown that the information was there. Things like the OS, that the lack of encryptions, the fact that it was open to the wide web.
Right, but that would have meant somebody, and again, you're dealing with a fairly large organization in, both of those examples where somebody would have actually had to, and it's several things. One, security team would have had to have known about it. Secondly, there would have had to have been some kind of sign-off to say, yes, we accept the risk or whatever. So then you got to look at the internal controls and go, who's managing the data, who's managing the risk, who's understanding the risk, and, at which point in time are either security or compliance or risk coming to the table to actually help understand all of this and deal with it, and then mitigate it and control it when necessary. Back to the conversation we had at the beginning, which is, for a large organization, how can they easily or readily keep track of all of their storage, their back ends, their front ends, and then obviously all the third parties? It's a nigh on impossible task, hence the concept of actually building, a threat intelligence practice.
Mm-hmm. And that's sort of where nothing is perfect, but threat intelligence tools that support your threat intelligence practice can support. The biggest issue there then becomes the sort of dearth of qualified analysts. Going back to that RSA report that I had quoted earlier, I think they were saying it was a 23% shortage in analysts. And even the ones that we do have, unfortunately, are not getting the same amount of sort of ramp up or education time they used to, because bad actors are sort of coming at us so quickly, and threats are emerging and evolving so quickly that analysts aren't able to keep up. So really it's down to the business processes and the practices and the understanding that there's a cyber threat intelligence group or risk and compliance or whoever ultimately manages it. But on top of it, it's tools to sort of automate and give those insights and give recommended actions when certain things are seen, both internally, this is what's going on my network, and externally, this is the outside view.
Right. Well, I mean, there's the challenge on any of this is always, we ran into it when a couple of companies ago, we actually had an intelligence platform that we were using and building, which is a lot of the companies that we interacted with were hesitant to accept threat intelligence because, unfortunately, it tends to mean they have more work to do. If they've already got an overworked staff that is, they don't necessarily have enough headcount, all of a sudden you turn up and go, hey, here's where your developers put something out here, here's where your network team this, here's where security needs to get involved in here, here's where, and you start going down a list of things that your intelligence platform was pulled up they need to focus on. Half the time they just look at you with a stink eye going, stop giving me more work. The flip side is, hey, now I'm actually helping to prioritize it for you, but it's a bit of an uphill struggle.
Oh, no, it absolutely is, especially in sort of lieu of the traditional intelligence platform that is essentially an aggregator for atomic indicators. The nice thing I think that we're seeing as the industry matures a little bit is some automation, hooking into orchestration tools, scoring and prioritization based off of sort of the expertise of certain core threat intelligence groups. The ability to prioritize based on source or criticality or threat type, and to enrich and contextualize that does at least take some of the onus off of people. But I absolutely agree with you that part of the problem is just fighting to get people to acknowledge that doing the additional work is worth it, because a breach, an issue is just so much more than sort of they realize. Right.
But I mean, it's, here's the thing. I mean, we've talked a little bit about tools, but you hit the nail perfectly, which is, the tool, the tool is only going to be as good as whoever's hands are on it. So let's start with the easy one. We need to actually take a step back and say, you know what, maybe actually for some companies, the tool is nothing more than just understanding their own landscape. By the way, use Google. The tool for others is probably a little bit more sophisticated, but you need the team in place, or you need a good service that's going to be in place to actually help you build an intelligence, package for you and for your clients that's actually going to be, it's going to accurately represent. That's one of the biggest challenges is, we keep throwing tools at a problem which is mostly a human-related issue.
Yeah, no, and that's, I think we are starting to see a shift as well to tool plus human. That the machine vetting, human vetting combination, and in cases that people are building the tools and they're realizing that people don't have the wherewithal to take advantage of them, they are in fact moving towards providing a warm body who actually has the skill set and can go out and address your vendors and say, here is a report, or go address the misconfigurations on your web servers, deal with S3 buckets, all of those things. The biggest issue is, at that point, what single individual has those skills. Now it needs one extra body, two extra bodies. So.
Right. So then we get back to then we get back to the prioritization issue, which is, I actually had a really good conversation with a friend earlier on today on Twitter, who was like, hey, threat intel is great, but I still have to get my patching done. And I'm like, you're right. It's tough. There's no easy solution. We've stood up and done a couple of talks on the whole concept of getting back to basics, get the patching done, get the systems done, and really the intelligence tool should be used to help you actually understand which of those focuses you need to be doing first. It isn't really its own standalone. It should really be there to help you determine which risks inside the organization that, need to be hit first based off of whatever criteria you're using for risk analysis.
Right.
Yeah, from a tradecraft standpoint, it's called Intel Ops for a reason. It is not just Intel, but it is also the ops side. It doesn't magically fix all of the operations issues. That being said, looking at things and understanding that, port 21 is open and you have Unix 13.3 running on it, and it likely still has the, root username password because you didn't know enough to close the FTP server. Or it's a downgraded patch. That is valuable information. It's intelligence that informs your operations and allows you to go and do those things that you're talking about there.
Right. I mean, if anything, organizations are looking for help to understand what their priorities are, and my sense is that's kind of where threat intelligence comes in. So yes, we need to. Mm-hmm. We've got a huge backlog of stuff we need to patch. What we really want to understand is what's most likely to be attacked in the near term, so that we can prioritize our energies and resources, human resources, to addressing the risks on that platform.
Right. I think it's important to balance what's most likely to be attacked with what is sort of most critical. A web server fairly close to everybody's access, is very important. A simple server set up in a DMZ that doesn't have a whole lot on it, it's very likely to be attacked, very easy to be attacked, isn't nearly as important as an Elasticsearch database deep in your network that's storing usernames and passwords and credit cards and addresses and all kinds of PII.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I'm going to go, so here's I'll argue this when I play devil's advocate for a second on this one, because that's going to change company to company to company and situation to situation. It's also going to be, how easy can I pivot from one side to another side or another architecture to another one. So, what is an attack vector for one might just be an opportunity for another. So you'd be careful with those statements.
Mm-hmm. That's fair.
I should remind our audience as well that there is a question feature. If you have questions for any of our presenters, use the Right Talk feature to pose the question, and we'll leave some time at the end of the conversation to get to them. Sorry, go ahead, Brandon.
Thank you. So I was just going to sort of continue to drive us along through other situations as we talked about there, sort of the shift to re-centralizing data and how that makes it somewhat easier to take a bulk of data. There's also the shift towards sort of key infrastructure pieces that sort of everybody within a particular industry is using, which makes them very popular targets to attack. Chris had brought up the Cisco firewall config files for a bit there. Cisco, Juniper, precursor to them, Epsilon, Kalpana were sort of the be-all, end-all in networking equipment, and items like that were having a config file or having a way through a Cisco firewall was a way to attack sort of everybody on a broader scale, and we're seeing that sort of in small on an industry level. The one that I was using as an example here was Swift attacks. Another one is certain point-of-sale systems. Within the hospitality industry, for example, everybody uses the same sort of general point-of-sale system. So if you can attack the point-of-sale system, you can end up collecting information from a wide variety of end users. We were seeing this with the Hyatt attack, with the ICG attack, things like that. And sort of as this is a metaphor for that, Swift attacks are becoming more and more common. Nowadays you see sort of, it seems like one a week, because it is such a critical piece of infrastructure, and it's built on sort of legacy software at this point. You had the City Union Bank attack that essentially consisted of 3 separate Swift transfers to different parts of the globe, 2 of which were ultimately blocked, but over $1 million was transferred and lost in China, and was collected by individuals with forged documents. It was a sort of a large-scale effort executed through this simple sort of supply chain piece, for lack of a better term, that all banks are required to use. And the Banks of Chile attack that took place just last week, Swift was utilized to steal almost $13 million. And attackers actually, going back to sort of mapping and having the full picture of the puzzle, they did their reconnaissance on the Bank of Chile. They had an understanding of what the IT departments were like, what their capabilities were, and they essentially used decoy attacks with wiping software against easily accessible terminals inside the bank to distract from the transfers taking place. So I think...
Go on, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, it's interesting, again, you talk about intelligence gathering and data intel on this stuff. You start digging down into the deeper and darker side of the internet, and you can, very quickly and very easily see how these are put together and look at the various different groups and who they bring to the table to execute certain parts of the strategy. It's, it's like the old days of Spy and Zeus, where you could rent time on it for doing certain things. Then you would go to another vendor and actually, buy the bot architecture you needed, buy the attack you needed. In this case, buy the Swift type attack you needed, and then buy a counter attack from there. So, this is, I think a lot of people need to realize that this is a lot more common and a lot easier, because basically it's a service on the darker side of the world.
It's hacking as a service. The one not necessarily nice thing about the ease of it, but the silver lining, if you will, is the fact that because it is so easy, it's being adopted by a lot of script kiddies and individuals who don't necessarily know what they're doing. They find the tools and they apply the tools, but they aren't always covering their tracks well or proxying correctly or hiding themselves from a forensics expert. So it becomes sort of routine to go pick them up or clean up the users of the software as a service. The issue is from a law enforcement agency standpoint, third-party standpoint, when there becomes that much noise because it is so easy to do, it becomes that much harder to track legitimate adversaries. Right.
Yeah, there's definitely something to be said for that. I mean, there's methodologies for doing it. Adversarial research is something that, I know some of the folks in that field, and they're actually fantastic at it. And, I mean, there's some amazing technology out there. I was talking with a company out in the Valley, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, called 4IQ, and they have some amazing tech which they use to actually do some really good adversarial research based off of all sorts of criteria, and the ability to actually get to the right person in the right place can be done very, very quickly. So just as those guys try to cover their tracks, there's some amazing ways of actually uncovering some of the intel on those.
Yeah, and there's more, not necessarily on the uncovering side, but on the proactive side, there's a shift from the the sort of tactical atomic level indicators to actually more strategic, mapping things to TTPs and behaviors and starting to identify sort of key targets. That way, when the attacks take place, you can more rapidly shift between this is a legitimate threat, this is an actor that's known, this is the next behavior, as opposed to this is just, you know, an 18-year-old kid trying to make a name for himself.
Right. But again, you know, to the point of this talk, it's all about having that intelligence. How do we gather that intelligence? Mm-hmm. And then obviously, how do we disseminate it? I mean, that's one of the big things is, you know, there is so much intelligence out there. How do we disseminate it effectively enough for people to be able to use it inside an environment? That's, you know, one of the biggest challenges I think I've seen.
Right, because otherwise it's just another noisy tool, right, that is keeping people from being able to sort of see what's in front of their eyes. So I guess that's, yeah, I mean, how do you operationalize it? What are some good steps for actually working the, you know, or reaping the benefits from this intelligence, right?
Right. You know.
Yeah, and I do think, oh, Chris, please go ahead.
No, go for it, please.
I was just going to say, I think that, you know, a big part of it is, and that's where, more than anything, we're really seeing tools start to shine, is helping people with prioritizing, disseminating, doing the correlations, enrichment on the back end side, sort of taking multiple feeds of similar types, running them against each other, understanding where they actually overlie, what's just noise, what's things that are appearing, mapping them against registration data so that we can see what are actually just sinkholes registered for research purposes, doing scoring based on what the threat types are, where they're coming from, mapping to actual standards that let us say, you know, spam is less important than a botnet, and sort of prioritizing all the threats so that when it comes time for a human to look at it and vet, he goes from the, you know, 5 million atomic indicators to the 12,000 threats that actually need to be addressed, and then taking that and using it against your event management, using it against your net flow, all of those pieces, until ultimately you can get down to events that need monitoring, need understanding. And there are still things that are going to fall outside of that 0 days, an anomalous action, but it's really about prioritizing, sorting the wheat from the chaff, and making it a manageable amount that people through tradecraft can then apply. And then ultimately it's training people to be able to do it.
I think it's, so I'll add an extra dimension into this one that we haven't really talked about. Again, goes back to the conversations out in the Valley a couple of weeks ago with the crew there. They actually gather previous breach data. So not only are they looking at the research and the intelligence that's out there, they're actually looking at all the previous breach data that's out there. So everything from password dumps to account dumps to system dumps to, you know, some very famous ones that we've been talking about, and obviously a hell of a lot of others. And the idea with the intelligence is to take what you know about the human, take what you know about the breaches, and to try to do some cross-referencing and correlation. So that's really useful, because not only are you saying, hey, you know, here's your attack vectors, you're also going, and by the way, here are, you know, 100 email accounts that are tied into your users. By the way, here's where they were pulled from, and here's the adversaries that were on those systems, and here's the adversarial groups. Therefore, here's the potential attack vectors and the likelihood of how they're going to come after you. It's taking it to a whole new level, which is really nice, because again, now not only are you having to look at just remediation, but now you can reprioritize that much more effectively.
So, Brandon, you know, because with the time we have left, we have about 10 minutes left, I thought I'd kind of turn it over to the audience. I mean, one question would be, we've been talking about the third-party risk, business partners, vendors, suppliers. How can threat intelligence broadly, you know, LookingGlass in particular, help you to you know, figure out which of your suppliers or business partners might have a higher risk profile or worse cyber hygiene, or both? and help you address that? So that might be a good question to start off with.
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, I think I'll address it in the broader sense, and then just being a LookingGlass guy, I'll let you know how we ourselves can help take care of it. In the broader sense, sorry, I was just going to say, in the broader sense, it's important to sort of continuously audit the networks of your vendors to actually have an understanding of them, and to establish practices and processes that you then share with your vendors, and sort of establish an expectation that they hold to them. Unfortunately, that is not always the case. So LookingGlass, through our sort of unique expertise, we began by mapping the public internet, the topology of the web, and then overlaying it with indicators, threats, vulnerabilities, as well as just sort of observations, things like open ports and expired certs. And what you can do is you can sort of bundle your vendors based on that information, that the BGP routing information, the network topology, the registration information, domain information, and you can say, I want to continuously monitor on all of these IPs and domains and information and look continuously for those threats that occur. That's actually how our main threat intelligence platform is used, both by large vendors, small and government vendors.
Okay. So I mean, I think one of the things that both you and Chris have kind of mentioned in different ways is, historically these have been capabilities that have been more common at large, wealthy firms, financial services firms, banks, defense industrial base, and so on. How do smaller vendors, enterprise, or even small enterprise, do this, especially given the challenges we've spoken about in terms of finding threat intelligence professionals, finding the right people to operate the tools?
So one way to do it is through sort of managed services, white glove services, whether it's things like managed detection and response, managed security service providers, taking advantage of sort of lower cost tools that automate large amounts of the process for you. It really is, the biggest problem that we see is one of time and knowledge. And the two biggest things can be sort of outsourcing the time and the knowledge, or taking advantage of tools that automate pieces that people don't necessarily understand yet. It's not a perfect solution, as Chris has brought up time and time again, that the human vetting piece is sort of core to success. But the statistical significance of a small amount of information is still great, and a small amount of changes and improvements is still a lot better than none.
Chris, what are your thoughts? I mean, what do you see out there? You do a lot of work individually with companies. Is it still mostly large, affluent companies that are trying to address this, using threat intelligence and trying to address this third-party supplier risk, or are you seeing smaller companies do it as well?
I think it's a lot of the larger organizations, or maybe those that have critical intelligence or critical... Hang on a second, I'm just going to put you on mute.
Yep.
Oh, sorry, I had to cough. I think it's a lot of the larger organizations. Yeah, I know. And, I mean, you'll get some of the small to medium ones, depending upon the criticality of the data that they have. Yep. But what we're trying to persuade people to do is, even just simple basics, that whole back to the basic concept of, when you actually bring a third-party vendor in, just do something simple like Google them, for crying out loud, or go on to, privacyrights.org and see if they've already been breached. Take a look at who you're handing data to and ask them a couple of extra questions, and then keep asking those questions. It's like when the vendor comes up and goes, well, we can look after your data and we've got a SAS 70 type 2, and I'm like, well, that's pretty for you. Why don't we actually do something useful for a change? So, but I mean, that's what it is. It's knowing, even simple stuff. There's definitely a need for the consolidated reporting, but even just getting out there and doing some basic, simple simple legwork on your own, to find out,
there are firms and services that kind of will we'll try and kind of give a security credit rating, I guess, to companies. Is that part of this, or is that something actually you can kind of do on your own? Maybe you don't need to hire a separate company to do that.
I think while helpful, the biggest problem with doing something like that is the biggest problem with doing a full penetration test. It's just a snapshot in time.
Yeah.
It's you have to continuously update your scorecard, continuously pay and buy new ones if you really want to have insight into the network. It's a great touch base if you want more in-depth information than you can get in Google. If you want to know about sort of the depth of issues with their network, but it also still has the problem of what about next week? What about the week after that? What about the week after that? That third-party monitoring, risk scorecarding as a service right now, the big issue that I see with it is the fact that it's not continuous. You sort of need some sort of a platform that once you've set those parameters, it gives you updates indefinitely that says, look, these people are actually holding to what they said or actually doing what we've established.
Right. It's definitely is one. Sorry, go on.
And before our hour is done, if you are in the audience and you want to ask a question, use the chat feature now. Speaker, forever hold your peace. Guys, how, we talk about sort of the maturity curve for security. There's sort of crawl, walk, run, sprint maybe. Where do you need to be on that to leverage, be in a position to leverage threat intelligence services and operationalize them? Are there some investments you need to make before you should even consider bringing third-party threat intelligence feeds into the mix?
So I'll take a stab at this one first.
Sure.
So thoughts on this are a couple of things. It's all very well having the data. Knowing what to do with it afterwards is obviously the biggest thing. So procedurally inside an organization, having some level of either a maturity model or an understanding of metrics is going to be fairly key. So again, it goes back to this. I hand you a whole bunch of to-dos. How do you prioritize? How do you understand risk in the complexity of the rest of the organization's understanding of risk? So that framework needs to be in place as well. There's an argument to say that doing this earlier in the life cycle is probably better, because then that way you can actually understand where your risks are rather than taking guesswork on where they think they might be. If that makes any sense?
Makes sense to me. Brandon?
Yeah. That makes sense to me. I would also add to that one of the advantages of it early on is for some of the providers or some of the systems, they can provide you with if this threat type comes in, this is the remediation action, this is the process. Because, in the earlier stages, if you don't have the expertise to do that yourself, what Chris just laid out, it can be valuable or important to have somebody who understands sort of your own threat or security tradecraft on a broader sense, give you a recommendation of what to do, and that can go hand in hand with the threat intelligence coming in.
Do you need a SIM? I mean, do you need to have some ArcSight or some other, kind of robust security information management platform already, or is that not?
I don't think so. I actually think threat intelligence platforms serve smaller companies better than necessarily SIMs do, just because rather than being pure aggregation of every possible data source, they do some of the work of the prioritization. They do some of the work of the understanding the topology. It isn't just a sort of a blank canvas of data for you to take advantage of. That's phenomenal if you are a more secure company. It's such a depth of information, but if you're in the lighter stage, the earlier stage, or if you just don't have the wherewithal to dive into that data, if you need something to prioritize for you, SIMs aren't necessarily the most valuable there.
Well, gentlemen, I think we're finding ourselves at the top of the hour. Before we go, I wanted to take an opportunity to thank both Brandon and Chris Roberts for taking the time to come in and talk about threat intelligence. Dina, any last words before we break?
Just a couple, Paul, and I definitely appreciate all of you gentlemen being a part of today's presentation. And then I also want to thank everyone in the audience that attended our webinar today. We will be sending out a copy of today's webcast in case you joined us late or if you would like to share it with your colleagues. This will be sent out to everyone following the webcast. And then also just to make sure if anyone needs to contact us, on this final screen is our website, which is LookingGlassCyber.com. Feel free to reach out to us if you need any other resources that were on displayed on your page today. But other than that, again, I appreciate you gentlemen and our audience as well. And we're out of time at this point. But again, thanks to everybody, and we'll wrap up.
Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks guys, and hope to talk to you again.
All right. Bye.